Hi. Hi, Matt.
Great to see you. So welcome to Grounded and Soaring, our podcast that explores how we might raise healthy kids in a too often unhealthy world. I'm Sam Shapiro, head of school at Marin Montessori School, and today we are absolutely thrilled that Madeline Levine is here to shed some light for us on this topic of raising healthy kids in a too often unhealthy world. Madeline Levine, PhD, is a psychologist with close to 40 years of experience as a clinician, consultant, educator, and author. Her New York Times bestseller, The Price of Privilege, explores the reasons why teenagers from affluent families are experiencing unexpectedly high rates of emotional problems. Teach Your Children Well, also a New York Times bestseller, tackles our current narrow definition of success. And her latest book, Ready or Not, focuses on helping parents prepare their children to thrive in an unpredictable and rapidly changing world. So, Madeline, thank you so much for joining us today. I reached out to you, given your expertise in parenting and in all your extensive work with working with especially adolescent and child and family, children and family clients around. Today's world is such a complex landscape for raising children, and wondering if, where you sit today in your extensive career and looking at the place we're in right now, and given the landscape of our young people growing up today, about your top 3 or 4 suggestions for parents to consider and adopt in order to raise healthy kids. And this is really sparked by a few things. One, we know that in the last decade, there's been a 300% rise in emergency room admissions for young people suffering from panic attacks, depression, anxiety, suicide ideation, and suicide attempts. But also the study that came out about 10 years ago now that was well publicized, and that's been replicated. There's been other studies that identified youth growing up in affluent areas as a risk group now, with higher rates of depression, and especially risks around substance use, and other mental health challenges. And knowing, your book that really was highly impactful when it came out, The Price of Privilege, and still impacts, also wanting to hear your thoughts today around the topic of, for those of us raising kids in affluent areas, and if we ourselves are raising them in affluence in our own home, what are some things especially we should think about?
Yeah, thank you. When you said, my long career, what do I see? You've hit on the most disturbing thing I see, which is when I wrote The Price of Privilege, which is almost 20 years ago, it was worrisome. And it's even more worrisome, as your numbers suggest now. So I wrote another book called Ready or Not, to address the fact that things hadn't gotten better. And that's incredibly disturbing, because there has been a whole group of people trying to change the culture around kids. And it's been very difficult to change. So before I start, there's one thing I want to say as a caveat. And that's, many parents, and often in affluent communities, parents are convinced that every move they make is going to be helpful or hurtful, or they're listening to one expert or another expert. And I have a strong feeling, having raised 3 children, being a researcher and a clinician, and 3 grandchildren now, parents count. We count for a lot, but we don't count for everything. And the research is pretty clear that a lot of what we see in our kids has a genetic basis to it. And so the idea I'm fond of is genetics loads the gun and environment pulls the trigger. And so we can't control everything, but we can control the environment. So I'm going to address the environment as the part of how children develop that we do have some impact on. And there's a whole bunch of things that I'm guessing your audience knows, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on them. And that's things like have a stable household and have some structure and eat well and sleep. My guess is everybody who's listening to this knows those things already. But there are 3 things I want to talk about that I think get overlooked and we have good research on, and I think they're really important. And the first of those is the escalating rates of anxiety. So it used to be depression was the thing most of us were focused on 20 years ago. And depression is still troublesome. It's about 13% of kids have a mood disorder, but about 30% of kids have an anxiety disorder. So I want to address anxiety for a few minutes. I think because the world is very frightening, and so it's not just kids who are anxious, we're all anxious, and anxiety is uncomfortable. And so I think there's a tendency for parents to come in early on their child's anxiety, not in terms of clinical work, but to try and prevent their kids from getting anxious for two reasons. One, you don't want to see your own child struggling with anxiety. And two, if you're anxious and your child is anxious, it ups your own anxiety. And this is how I see it play out. Say you have a 9-year-old daughter who walks to school, hopefully walks to school. And one day the dog is barking and she comes home and she's scared and teary. Ma, I can't go back to school. The dog's barking. I'm afraid. And, you have like three options. You can do oh my God, that's terrible. You must have been so frightened. I'm going to talk to the woman who owns the dog, and tomorrow I will drive you the other way, sort of accommodating the anxiety. That's one option. Another option is, basically man up. And you've walked past that dog 1,000 times. You're going to walk past that dog tomorrow, which is not all that helpful when you're anxious. Get over it. And the third one is to have empathy with your child, but they've walked past that dog. That dog's behind a fence. How do you help your child manage that small anxiety of their childhood without feeling either overwhelmed or diminished by it? And I'd say it's, depending on the family, it's something like, yeah, that sounds really scary, a little bit of empathy. Maybe tomorrow I'll walk with you if that would help. But after that, I think you'll be able to do it on your own. I mean, so you're combining empathy with the clear message that it's a challenge your child can handle. And, I see the outcome of all the challenges kids have that they can't handle. And I'm not talking about kids who really are sick, but the kid who comes home from college says, I can't live with my roommate. I have to transfer. Or there was a mouse in the dorm and I'm out of my mind and I can't live there anymore. And these are young people who have not sort of participated in the managing the kinds of challenges that come their way. And I don't think any of this is out of bad intention. I think what it leads to, however, is what I call accumulated disability. You keep stepping in for your kid and they never get the opportunity to learn that they, in fact, can manage challenge. And sometimes they can't, and sometimes we can't. But that's part of the opportunity to learn. And if you're always stepping in for your kid, it's a kind of robbery. We think we're being protective, but in fact, we're actually robbing kids of the opportunity to have that sense of bravery. I like the idea of the brave family. Life is scary, and we're all trying to overcome challenges in the world, in our home, in our communities. And I think it's a lot better to send the message that it's tough, but we'll manage. So that's one thing I see.
Does anything come to your mind around how we as parents, as our children get older, how we're gauging what is the right edge of challenge to let them really grapple with?
That is a great question, which is, how do you know if this is actually manageable for your child, or if your expectations are really out of line and it's traumatic for your child?
Either too tight or too loose almost. I guess the risk is more too loose. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know that I have a formula for that. I think parents know their children incredibly well. And nothing that I or any expert says can talk about your particular child. I can talk about children in general, but not your particular child. So I think parents instinctively know when they calm their own anxiety first, instinctively know more or less what their child is capable of, and your child will let you know if you've overestimated their capacity. I think we have a harder time doing that as our kids get older. We feel the stakes are higher. So, the example I always use, now I have very little grandchildren, they're learning to walk, right? They take a few steps, they fall down, everybody is, yay, keep going. Nobody is like, oh my God, you're going to end up like burgers at McDonald's or something if you don't, right? So because we're at ease about knowing the outcome of that, we're able to tolerate it and we understand how that's beneficial. So I think maybe one thing that one can look at is, what's the outcome of this? I can tell you if that child doesn't go to school and is kept home because, it's too scary, that's a really bad outcome. One of the toughest things to work with is school refusal. So I think you have to think, it's kind of risk reward. If it seems really terrifying to the child or the outcome is going to be to inhibit their development, then you probably fall on the side of I probably should allow this to play out. You can always come in afterwards.
Yeah.
It also means that we have to tolerate our own anxiety. And an example I use a lot is when my kids were younger, my youngest son, Jeremy, had asthma. And it was well controlled. And he was invited to a rock climbing camp in Yosemite. And I knew it would be a good thing for him, but there was no hospital where they were rock climbing. And I knew I should let him go. And I did. I don't think I breathed that whole weekend. I was terrified, but it was a good thing for him. And now in retrospect, I would have probably tried to calm down my own anxiety ahead of time. I probably didn't have to suffer that much. I knew he knew how to handle asthma and he had an inhaler. So I think a lot of these mistakes come out of parents' own anxiety, separation anxiety, the mom who's holding on to the kindergartner at the wall as the child is being led off to school. That's the mom's anxiety. And you and I are talking about child anxiety, but it's really important to keep in mind that our anxiety is also 1 in 3.
Yeah. I mean, is 1 in 3, 30% of us.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
so,
that's right.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. Yeah. I mean, I recently read a poem that I loved where it was a mom kind of writing a poem to her young child. And she says, I'm not going to get it exactly right, but something like, may you never confuse anxiety with love. And that made so much sense to me. And it's just really resonating, the idea that actually to raise kids who are brave in the world, we have to be able to manage our fear and anxiety. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I said like separation anxiety, as your kids grow up, you'll learn more and more about how you actually parented.
Yeah, they'll tell you.
And all 3 of my kids at one time or another have said to me, why did you always greet us with, are you okay? They'd come home from school and I'd go, are you okay? And it's interesting to me that really made an impression on them. And I understand that, I lost a parent young, like the world's pretty unpredictable. And if I had a chance to redo it, I'd redo it. It's not the way to greet your child with your own anxiety. And this relates to what we're talking about. I think sometimes parents don't know their children as well as they should, in quotes. We're preoccupied with achievement, with grades, with colleges, with what children do as opposed to who our children are. And, this is especially an issue in affluent communities where the expectations are so high the notion that a kid is the accumulation of everything they do is so toxic. The number of kids I have seen, that's 40 years of treating kids, teenagers mostly and young adults, kids who have said to me, I'm only as good as my last performance. And I think about that so much as somebody who's a speaker and a writer and clinician. It's like, sometimes it goes really well and sometimes it's okay. And I've made a habit when I was on the road, like a lot, I made a habit of calling my kids after every talk I gave and telling them one thing that went wrong, and not as a big deal, but as the idea that, it's not like you master math and you're done. Life continues to present challenges, so I'd say, it went great. I tripped again coming up the stairs, because kids don't know that their parents also meet challenges on a daily basis and sometimes struggle with them and sometimes have figured out how to handle them. But I think I know from talking to kids that they see their parents as omnipotent. They can, especially younger kids, they can handle anything.
The other thing I was thinking about, Madeline, is when you talk about adolescence, and in order for us to trust our gut about where our kids' edge of challenge is and where we should let them struggle a little bit, is that we have to know our kids. And what I've seen in my career, and I'm sure you've seen it in yours, is that when children become adolescents, a lot of times their parents have an expired worldview about who that kid is. Mm-hmm. They're seeing their 14-year-old as if they're still an 11-year-old. Mm-hmm. And that kid is different.
Right.
And I've seen a lot of parents really struggle with, getting information about their kid did this thing, mm-hmm. and they just cannot believe that's their kid. So it seems like there's another painful piece for, especially as kids become adolescents, where parents need to really make it an intention to, I want to know who my kid is today.
The capacity to listen to your kid and keep your mouth shut and just, it's not enough to not talk. I mean, I think all the time people confuse this thing that I say with just not speaking. But what they're doing, if you dig down a little bit, is they're formulating the response in their head. The kid hasn't finished the sentence yet, and the parent already has formulated the response. So you want your child to be successful, then you have to raise them in a healthy environment, to have respect for themselves and respect for other people. That's it.
I've talked a lot about the loneliness crisis to our families, and it's really time to get out of our habituated isolation from COVID. It's really hurting us. But can you talk a little bit about more how having a life that's not just focused on our children is important for our children?
So here's the reality. Your kids grow up. If your whole life is invested in your kids, you're going to be you think you're lonely now, you're going to be a very lonely person. You start hanging out around the lacrosse field again by yourself because it reminds you of that time in life. You're also modeling that friends are not important and community service is not important. And those are things that we want our kids to do. You want to take your kids with you when you're delivering meals to shut-ins or cancer patients, or you want them to see you in a community, because I think this hyper focus on kids, like I said a little earlier, is about a lack of a whole structure around us. When I was growing up, my mother and her mother and my aunts and uncles, and we all had dinner together once a week. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that is gone. And I get calls often like, well, we always go on vacation together for all these years. And now my 14-year-old wants to bring a friend along. And that friend's not part of the family. So what should I do? And it's like, bring that friend into the family, expand the family, and show your kid that that's a good thing in life, that you respect the idea that they want to bring a friend, that they have somebody they're close to, instead of only feeling like it's a rejection of us as a family, that they want to bring somebody else. And that's that's the point you had made earlier and made so well, is that your child has changed, and you better get on board with it, because otherwise they start hiding it, right?
Right.
If you are open to change and you say, that's a great idea to bring your friend, one, you have eyes on them, you see what kind of relationship. You say, oh no, in our family, it's just our family, then your kid goes off and can do God knows what, because they don't trust that you have any receptivity to other people. So that business about having a life of your own, it benefits you, because you should be growing too. How do you expect your kid to keep growing if you're not?
Yeah. So going back to everything, my identity is so wrapped up in my child, is because that's all I'm focusing on.
It comes out of a place, I think, of profound loneliness, which you had alluded to earlier.
Do you have other different or, more specific suggestions around raising kids in affluent areas or in affluence ourselves that you haven't mentioned in the kind of the three key themes that you've talked about already?
So I think the one thing I would say is highly successful parents always underestimate the impact of that on their children. And that has become a theme for me, is that, there are some very, very successful parents that I work with who keep a low profile, and who don't live in the biggest house on Broadway or whatever. So think that that's the insurance against their kids. But the kids know who their parents are. Everything is public knowledge. So they know what your house costs. They know how much money you have. And I think this is very hard. The idea that I value you for who you are, and there are many ways to be successful, and to truly communicate that when parents have untold resources is very, very difficult.
Are there any role models out there or strategies you've seen of these highly accomplished parents being able to inoculate their kids?
Yes. So one thing is very early getting the kids to understand the relationship between effort and work and outcomes. So when it doesn't work, Sam, it's because parents are constantly buying their way out of dilemmas with their kids. Oh, you're depressed, let me get you a Tesla. Doesn't work at all. The most successful families, they start at 5. There's a savings jar, there's a spending jar, and there's a charity jar. And they get, I said to one of the wealthiest families in the world, who asked about what's appropriate insurance allowance for a 6-year-old, and I said $5 a week, and they thought it was too much. So they thought $3 was. So really making that relationship between you want something, work for it. I've had the most successful families like that. Kid wants a car, kid has a job, works, doesn't get handed anything. It's the relationship between work and outcome that gets stressed from day one. And the most successful families have had their kids work outside the family business, so they know they have to show up on time. They know other people will have to work harder. It's not very different than what I'm talking about for any family. Right. It's just bigger. Right.
This has been an awesome conversation. I can't thank you enough. And you got to run, but I'm really great. We're so grateful for your time and sharing your wisdom with us today.
Absolutely, Sam. Thank you for having me.
Have a great one. Okay.
You too. Bye-bye.